Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. I'm actually in Barcelona, very bizarrely. I'll explain this at the end because the Telegraph are doing a hit piece about it. You think they've got better things to do with their time. But nonetheless, we have an action-packed show today covering a very, very substantial number of issues, and very, very important issues they are too. We are going to talk in the show, almost all the show, about Emma Watson. Now, you may have seen what's happened. Emma Watson has been falsely defamed as an anti-Semite for one of the most innocuous displays of solidarity with the Palestinian people that you can even contemplate or imagine. But the reason we're talking about it isn't to censor Emma Watson. I'm sure she wouldn't want to be censored, and very clearly wouldn't want to be censored in the media discussion, which has all the absolute firestorm that has enveloped her as a consequence of this innocuous Instagram post. But more broadly, what it says at the moment in terms of the assault against Palestinian solidarity, the attempt to delegitimize the most basic acts of solidarity with the Palestinian people, but also what this says about anti-Palestinian racism, an issue which is completely absent from this discussion, the total dehumanization of the Palestinian people to the extent that showing any sort of solidarity or even acknowledging the existence of the Palestinian people is deemed as an act of intolerable hatred. So we're going to talk about that with two very brilliant guests, a leading Palestinian civil society leader from Ramallah and a brilliant, prominent Jewish peace activist who I believe is here in London, who also has a beautiful cat, which we're always very keen to host on this particular show. Before I bring in our first guest, though, just housekeeping as ever. If you're watching live, click through to YouTube, press like and subscribe. You can support the show. We're going to be doing 2 shows a week. So do support us on patreon.com/ownjones84. That's how we make the documentaries. We're not funded by billionaires. We're only made possible because of your support. And you can also support us using Super Chat on YouTube. You can put questions to the guests. I will read out and thank everybody by name at the end of the show, which I will remember to do on pain of death. Otherwise, I will get a very angry load of WhatsApps later from the team. Also, do listen to us on our podcast, because this is obviously, well, maybe you are listening to this on the podcast, in which case just ignore me and carry on listening on the podcast. But if you are, you can download us, leave a review as ever, and help support us that way. But we're going to go straight on now to our first fantastic guest, who has been vindicated, one of the Colston 4. This is 4 activists who were being prosecuted for their lawful, we can say, heroic acts to take down a prominent slaver who is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of slaves, a barbaric period of human history, which has largely been scrubbed away. We don't talk about the real horrors of the slave trade, but because of the actions of people like Rhian, sorry, pronounce your name right, who is on a campsite joining us through her phone. Thanks to your acts, we can have these discussions. That's the point. Before I bring you in, but firstly, congratulations. Just to explain, Rhian was one of 4 who was dragged through the courts, and a jury sat there, looked at the evidence, assessed it objectively, and they decided that you didn't break the law.
They did.
Can we just, before I ask you about this and talk about this, let's just show a clip of the moment that Edward Colston's statue was thrown into the river, which of course triggered this court case. A wholesome moment there, I would say. Yeah, just explain, how did you get involved? What happened?
Well, so I think it's the whole stage is set, obviously, by the fact that we've just spent the last couple of years dealing with a global pandemic, and COVID really gave a chance for me to sit and think about things. I wasn't really an activist before. I wouldn't call myself an activist, although it is funny that sort of I'm here in the context also alongside people talking about Palestine, because that was actually one of the main sort of movements that really inspired me before I ever became involved in activism. Really, before when my friend Lizzie visited Palestine, who was a photographer, and brought back the stories of the struggle of Palestinian people. So I will say that I will always stand in solidarity with Palestinians. But moving, to the before the 7th of June, the pandemic had hit, and we had, obviously on the 25th of May, the news of George Floyd's murder swept the world, and that really triggered something in everybody, I think. And at that point, I was reading a book called "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race," which you might know is written by Rennie Edo-Lodge. And it was through reading that and this sort of galvanizing of emotion and empathy for the struggle of people of color that really took place in those few weeks. And apologies, at this point in the day, I've done a lot of interviews. Yesterday was a very emotional day, and I'm flagging just a little bit.
The statue of Edward Colston that stood there, I mean, it was actually put there long after he died. I mean, it wasn't even a kind of... So talk about that.
So, I mean, it was erected 175 years after he died by a man called J.W. Arrowsmith, who tried to raise funds for a year or so, I think, in order to build the statue. Never got very much public support, which kind of negates this idea that's on the plaque, erected by the citizens of Bristol. It was never very widely supported, and the dissent around that statue has existed for around the last 100 years, going back to the 1920s. So it only really stood for 25 years without being contested at all. And obviously in the last 30 years, people really have been crying out, not only to remove the statue really, but to eradicate the myths of this man in the city who is venerated as this philanthropist who gave money to schools and hospitals, with absolutely no mention of the 84,000 people that he helped traffic and the business of the slave trade that he helped perfect.
So tell me about what that moment when you took down the statue. How did it happen? What were the kind of moments leading up to it?
So it's funny because I think the least believable thing within the trial, and actually one of the most true things, is that I did not know that Milo was going to have a rope, and Milo didn't know that I was going to have a rope. And I think you can see the jury looking at us like, really? It's like, no, it's true. The night before, I think I'd already decided that, the statue should come down if possible. And, my role in that so I work in the events industry, and I do a bit of rigging, so I have access to rope. And so I believe that I should take a rope that I owned, do the protest, and offer it to the people of Bristol should they wish to try and pull it down. And there was conversations in the night before, because I already knew Sage and Milo beforehand. But this was more like, us validating the fact that it would be a good idea to do, but no one ever came up with any plan. No one ever said, you bring this, I'll bring that. So it really is like there's a lot of magic to this moment, in that it kind of seems almost like a collective consciousness sort of moment where everyone had simultaneously decided that is what was happening that day. And I've heard that around half an hour behind us was other people with ropes.
Just talk us through what when it was clear to you the jury weren't going to convict you. Just tell us, or was there do you think as the court was, obviously you weren't speaking to the jury, but as the evidence was being presented, did you have a hunch you were that this was going to be the result? And tell us, what does it signify? Because obviously a lot of the right now are saying, well, this just legitimizes criminal damage, it's a free-for-all. What do you say, what does this mean for peaceful civil disobedience? Was a long tradition in Britain. Lots of rights and freedoms were won through peaceful civil disobedience, but it's often demonized. What does it say that a jury of randomly selected British men and women sat there, looked at the evidence, and decided not to convict you?
I mean, well, obviously, throughout the whole process, I've personally felt very positive and never felt like a criminal. But so I've always been very positive that hopefully a jury could see that too. But it's all been down to the fact that the judges allowed us the defences that we relied upon. And I think the whole way through, you have to keep grounded and realize that it could go either way, because it is a divisive thing. It's just incredible that a jury has sat there through all the evidence, including David Olusoga's evidence, which was essentially around a 2-hour lecture on the history of slavery and empire and Colston. But it's interesting, this like you say, this rhetoric around direct action, and how I saw Robert Jenrick, actually the ex-housing minister, this morning saying on Twitter that there's no place for criminal damage, can't ever get us where we need to go, and it's just criminal. But obviously, if you look at the history of protest and of progress, without people such as obviously the suffragettes, who damaged things in order to make uproar in the name of women's right to vote, I wouldn't have the vote. So it just proves that direct action and sometimes making a big fuss about something does make us move forwards.
Just finally, in terms of Britain's own failure to come to terms collectively with the history of horrors. I mean, we've actually alluded to history we should be proud of. The history of people who struggled, like the suffragettes, trade unionists, people who fought for workers' rights, LGBTQ rights, often using the sorts of peaceful civil disobedience and more. I mean, the suffragettes did not just do peaceful civil disobedience, I should note, but the sorts of tactics you used. But we had empire in which, for example, in India, if people read a brilliant book called Late Victorian Holocaust, tens of millions of Indians died of unnecessary avoidable famines under British rule. The standard of living in India was the same as England before colonialism. Whether it be Kenya, where in the 1950s, the mass incarceration of the Kikuyu tribe, the violent crackdown of the Mau Mau uprising. We're going to talk about Palestine. There's a legacy there. I mean, across Africa, across Asia, these huge horrors, as well as the slave trade. Do you think what you've done, it helps us have a discussion about the real history that is actually erased by this country?
Absolutely. I think it picks away at this narrative of, empirical pride, and I understand why the older generation have a problem perhaps with coming to terms with some of this, because they grew up waving flags and being proud of the history of the British Empire. And I heard someone say recently, actually, that a lot of that generation never saw what the empire was. They just were, they were there to wave flags and celebrate and, reap the benefits of it. So a lot of people didn't sort of actually see what the empire was. So it's hard to kind of come to terms with that. But yeah, I think that the statue coming down has really started to illuminate some of the legacy, the negative legacy that we've been left with. Without the transatlantic slave trade, racism wouldn't be, nearly, in terms of like African people, wouldn't be nearly as much of a problem. Like that divide was created almost intentionally, and I think it's used continuously to divide us. Even today, Priti Patel is sharing, thoughts about refugees, and like you've got this nationality and borders bill, and it's always the scapegoat, isn't it? There's always somebody used as the scapegoat, and I think we just need to sort of fight back against that and raise each other up and aim for some unity.
Rhian, huge congratulations on the verdict to you and to the three others. And as I've said, what you've done, it shows that peaceful civil disobedience does work and has worked throughout history. But secondly, the role you've all played in terms of forcing us to have a discussion about the horrors which are erased, the consequences of which we still live with today, which will be partly the discussion we're about to have. That's absolutely a huge critical contribution. So well done and take care.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you.
So we're going to go straight in. I can see, by the way, the Wi-Fi is a bit dodgy occasionally here, which we will try and resolve because we've not obviously done this from Barcelona before, but we will get there. We will get there. Let's bring in our next two guests because we're going to talk about Emma Watson and what this represents. I'm going to bring in Em Hilton, who is a fantastic activist, who is with one of the co-founders of NAMOD, which helps coordinate Jewish peace activists here in Britain. Hey, Em, how are you doing?
Hi, good to see you.
Very good to see you as well. And let's bring in the brilliant Salem Barahmeh, who is the Executive Director of Rābet by PIPID. Is that right? Have I said it right, Salem? I might have got that completely out.
Yes.
Are you in Ramallah right now? Is that right?
I am, yes.
So Salem is joining us live from Ramallah in Palestine. Well, it's great to see you both. How are you both doing?
Good. Thank you for having us.
Let's just start. I'm going to bring up, even with my dodgy Wi-Fi connection here in Barcelona, which I can see, I'm going to bring up, let's just show the Instagram post which sparked this. The most innocuous Instagram post in history. If anyone is vaguely political and follows any political accounts, you wouldn't blink looking at this. Solidarity is a verb that comes from the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed. Do look up her work. She quotes, "Solidarity does not assume that struggles are the same struggles." Read the full quote; it's brilliant, and it shows some Palestinian activists. That was it. That was the whole thing. That was the post. Now, this triggered the Israeli ambassador, former Israeli ambassador to the UN. To smear her as an anti-Semite, which then led to coverage across various outlets. Emma Watson's pro-Palestinian Instagram post sparks anti-Semitism spat. Now, I suppose that in itself, I'll just bring you in, Em, because that in itself, what will now, I wonder just this as in terms of, how this could have a chilling effect. Because now, anti-Semitism is an extremely serious allegation. Anti-Semitism is responsible for some of the worst crimes in human history. Well, the Shoah being within living memory, the extermination of 2/3 of European Jews, the attempted extermination of all European Jews, but 2,000 years of blood libel, expulsions, pogroms, murder. Our culture is drenched in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is extremely serious. So now, Emma, people will see debated Emma Watson and anti-Semitism, scandal. What impact do you think that has, Em? Let's start with you.
Well, I think what was so interesting about this particular moment is the crudeness of the former ambassador's response to sort of just completely denigrate this as anti-Semitism when it clearly isn't, is actually a really important moment for exposing this strategy that often is put on by far-right Israel advocates to sort of denigrate any kind of solidarity with Palestinians as anti-Semitic. And I think what was really important in this moment, firstly, that we had a chorus of voices saying, no, this isn't anti-Semitic, particularly and importantly, from my perspective, Jewish voices saying that this wasn't anti-Semitic. And I think that shows a real shift in the mentality around the sort of mainstreaming of Palestinian solidarity. So I think that is really important. And the fact that people like Emma Watson, like Sally Rooney, are like actually speaking out on the issue of Palestine solidarity is great. And it's a really powerful moment. But I think what it also represents and what we can also see is a reaction to the sort of mainstreaming of Palestinian solidarity and the sort of popular how it's become more popular is that we have this very strong reaction, particularly from, I think, the Israeli government. For example, I don't think it's a coincidence that after what happened in May and we saw people taking to the streets in support of Palestinians' human rights, that the Israeli government has then taken extremely harsh steps to criminalize Palestinian solidarity. For example, the designating of 6 Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations with like little to no evidence whatsoever. And as a result, that's going to undermine Palestinian civil society more generally. And I'm sure Salem will speak to that. But we also see in Britain, as part of this authoritarian crackdown of the British government against our rights to protest, that they'll be introducing a bill in the House of Commons that will criminalize basically the right to boycott. And that's obviously an attack on the boycott, divestment and sanction movement. And the reason how they're justifying that is by saying we're protecting Jews and we're trying to fight anti-Semitism. So what we see with that is that Jews are being used as a shield for the government to have its own sort of anti-Palestinian policies and its own sort of authoritarianism. And that's really dangerous for Jews in Britain and for the Jewish community. And I think that's how what we see in this moment again is that like the issue of Palestinian liberation and this issue of anti-Semitism or Jewish safety are inherently intertwined. And that's why it's really important to sort of see this issue as a joint struggle and joint liberation.
Salem, when you saw what the Israeli ambassador wrote, how did you feel as a Palestinian?
Just unmuting. I was outraged, but it was expected. It's something we've seen happen for a very long time. And I really appreciate kind of the framing of tonight's conversation around anti-Palestinian racism, because as you saw, the backlash Emma Watson's post got, plus the media coverage, shows you how far the narrative and discourse has been skewed to one side of the conversation. Anti-Palestinian racism is never featured as part of this issue, and I think it's part of the crux of the matter. I mean, the response of calling that anti-Semitic is founded on the existence of the Palestinian people, that we don't exist. And that's part of the ideology. You know, Palestinians don't exist as a people. Palestine never existed ever. And so how dare we have freedom and rights? How dare we ask for them, demand them, and how dare the people stand with us? So therefore, any form of support, solidarity, or action of resistance, co-resistance by people who share the same values is usually targeted with smear campaigns and attacks. And it's often one of two things. Either it's the weaponization of the fight against anti-Semitism, which is a real problem all around the world, and we should all be tackling as forms of all hate. And also the use of labels as terrorism or terrorists, or really ugly stereotypes. But it's founded on this anti-Palestinian racism that has dehumanized us. And the narrative reflects that. And the way we can have that conversation, or the way it is had, has reflected. Now it's changed, and it is changing. But I think to properly tackle that, I think we need to address the underlying anti-Palestinian racism that exists.
I mean, let me just bring up, in fact, the post, just so people can see it. And this is a senior Likud politician, it should be said, who, speaking to the wider point about anti-Palestinian racism, which we will focus on, opposes the right of the Palestinians to have their own nation, to determine their own future. 10 points from Gryffindor for being an anti-Semite. Now, I mean, we'll talk about this more broadly. I mean, we will keep focusing on anti-Palestinian racism, but let's look at other recent examples. Desmond Tutu, as near as a secular saint as you're likely to get, recently denounced by Alan Dershowitz, the man who was a rampant anti-Semite and bigot. That's how he was denounced. Sally Rooney, also an iconic Irish author. She, in line with boycott, divestment and sanctions, turned down a specific contract with a specific Israeli publisher, which was widely misportrayed as her refusing to allow her book to be translated into Hebrew, which is not true. She was made it clear she'd be very happy to have that done, and her previous books have also been translated. I mean, so what we can see here, I mean, we'll talk about the kind of broader in terms of other civil society, but any figure who does speak out, and we've seen other examples like Paris Hilton deleted tweets in solidarity. I mean, Paris Hilton was not the Palestinian ally I was expecting, but hey, join in, get involved. But I mean, what does that, I mean,
no relation to me either, just to clarify.
Yeah, I was going to say, just in case anyone thinks that, I mean, I don't know. I presumed not, but I don't want to be presumptuous. Yeah, I mean, so we're seeing quite a systematic targeting of any individual who speaks out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clearly a strategy of like the right or far right Israel advocates to try and sort of say that any kind of solidarity with Palestinians is anti-Semitic, and I think that also speaks to the fact that a lot of what Israel is doing, they're losing the argument internationally, right? Like apartheid is unjustifiable, occupation is unjustifiable. So what do you do if you can't win the argument? You try and silence the argument entirely, and rightly, people don't want to see themselves or don't want to be anti-Semitic. Like I think generally people think anti-Semitism is bad. So people don't want to risk being labeled an anti-Semite, and it is weaponized in this way so that people don't want to speak out in support of Palestinians in case they are labeled as such. And I think that's why it's really important, or what a role I think Jews are coming out in support of Palestinian solidarity and really seeing this as part of our struggle too, as like people who care about human rights and equality and dignity for all, to come out and challenge that and say, this is a weaponization of anti-Semitism. We will not sit back and let people say that the mere existence of Palestinians is in some way inherently a threat to Jews or an attack on Jewish safety. I think that is such an egregious and racist thing to say, frankly. And I think that's what's so interesting in this moment, though, is that we still, within this sort of more mainstreaming cultural situation, like we do actually have people feeling more able to say that. And I think that to some extent gives me hope for things going forward. But we do also have to keep an eye on the way in which like the states that like and state military violence and the Israeli government or the British government might try and crack down on that from a more policy or legislative framework. But I do think it's important that whilst those smears have been put into the public sphere, they haven't carried a lot of weight. And I think that is different to maybe 10, 15 years ago.
I mean, Salem, how effective do you think, or in terms of your own work, appealing for solidarity with the Palestinian people, I mean, what kind of impact have you seen yourself, this whole strategy, in terms of preventing people within the West from using their platforms and their voices to show solidarity with the Palestinian people?
It's very effective. It's very effective, I think, because it's a campaign that is being carried out by the Israeli government and its allies, and it's extended also to the legal and political and policy sphere. So, for example, I don't know if you've been following, but 6 Palestinian civil society organizations were falsely labeled as terrorist organizations by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So they could stop any form of international funding to these civil society organizations. I mean, this is an agricultural union organization. This is an organization that documents the human rights of children. One of Palestine's biggest human rights organizations. It's been documenting Israeli violations for decades. And this is part of it here, but also it extends abroad, where in places like Germany, you can't rent a venue to host a Palestinian film night because there's fear that anything that with the word Palestine or Palestinian will be associated with anti-Semitism. So, and then a step further, I mean, they're criminalizing any form of Palestinian activism that is founded on the on BDS and other forms of activism. So it's becoming an extremely shrinking space where the room to maneuver, the room to speak out, usually has very severe consequences, whether it's legal, financial, political, and people need to really think twice about ever standing up and speaking out. So whether it's in Palestine or abroad, this is having really, really severe consequences.
I wonder if this is overreach, because I've actually seen voices I wouldn't have expected say, whoa, this is obviously ludicrous. You can't just use anti-Semitism to shut down any form of solidarity with the Palestinian people, from people we wouldn't associate with the left, or indeed people associated with the cause of Palestinian solidarity. I mean, do you think it is overreach? And do you think it's also a sign of weakness? Because actually, if you look at the polling across Western countries, including Britain, there has been actually a very marked turnaround in public opinion, public attitudes towards, when you look at towards specific countries. It's quite a crude way of looking at things, but the reputation of Israel has plummeted in Britain and in other European countries. So is it partly overreach? And that overreach is coming from a defensive position of weakness? Is that an optimistic way of looking at it? And that's why more stars are speaking out, because it's becoming more widely accepted, particularly amongst younger people. Oh, that's Em. Sorry, go for it. Em, sorry. Em and then to Salem, sorry.
Oh, okay, sure. So yeah, I think it is really interesting. I think it does show potentially a shift, but I also think that, with the growth of social media, with the growth of I think Palestinian voices, particularly Palestinian activists, journalists, and also just the reality of the facts on the ground. Like I'm in Palestine, Israel right now, and just the day-to-day brutality and reality of what's happening here. It's indefensible, and I think that is becoming clearer and clearer. So I think that it's an interesting moment that we're living through, where there are these very extreme tactics, which perhaps maybe did work more effectively, 10, 15 years ago, which just don't seem to add up. And I also think that there is also a growing movement of Jewish and Palestinian solidarity. Because obviously, this idea of trying to claim that supporting Palestinians is anti-Semitic is also a classic tactic of the right, to divide and conquer, divide us from each other and say that there's not enough room for everyone at the table, so one of you has to go. And I think what we've seen over, particularly in the last decade, is a real concerted effort to build Jewish-Palestinian solidarity on the ground in terms of movements of people Jews going to the West Bank and the occupied territories and being in solidarity with Palestinian communities there. But also internationally, where we've seen the rise, particularly in the US, of shifting conversations around Israel-Palestine through movements like If Not Now or Jewish Voices for Peace. In the UK, I think a broader sort of Jewish anti-occupation voice is coming into the fold. And so I think that it's much harder to just say that this is anti-Semitism, because there are lots of Jewish people, I think in particular, saying, no, this isn't anti-Semitism. And every time you say that it's anti-Semitism, you are undermining the real and important fight against the rise of white supremacy, the rise of white nationalism, the far right anti-Semitism, which is really dangerous. And so I think that that's sort of where this shift is. So yeah, I'm hopeful in that respect. I think things are changing, and it's changing through that Jewish-Palestinian solidarity.
What do you think, Salem? Do you think this is a sign of actually insecurity because public attitudes in the West are actually changing, including in the United States? And there, it's not just Americans. If you look at polling of American Jews, very widespread hostility to the policies of the Israeli government.
Yeah, I think there was a watershed moment in the global conversation around Palestine this summer when there was a lot of coverage in social media, kind of engagement on what was happening in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian families there, the war on Gaza, and all the events that followed. And I think there was an inspiration from the previous summer of the Black Lives Matter movement in the way the world also rallied around that. And so talking about Palestine, supporting Palestine, entered the mainstream in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime. So it was quite moving. I think where the gap is, Owen, is at the moment that public opinion is not reaching elected officials, those that are in power, that are affecting policy. To give you one example, even though the majority of Democrats, the base in America supports, sanctions on Israel, I think right after Israel was bombing Gaza, the U.S. Congress voted to renew military funding to Gaza to replenish the Iron Dome system. To give you one example of that, similarly in the UK, where, as you said, Israel's popularity probably plummeted to a low. The UK government is still one of the biggest supporters of Israel, and we see that all over Europe and the US and different parts of the world. And similarly, in Palestine, the apartheid regime that we live under is becoming increasingly severe, and whether it's through its policies of oppression, violence, ethnic cleansing, etc., it seems that they are getting away with more. And this ideology of building greater Israel, and erasing anything that's Palestinian is moving forward every day without any accountability. And I think that links back to this conversation we're having today around anti-Semitism and the weaponization of it. And anti-Palestinian racism. It was never fully held accountable. And so Israel and its allies have gone away with it for so long as things have gotten increasingly worse. And if we don't introduce accountability as part of this conversation, as part of the smear and attack tactics, or whether it's elected officials and policymakers who are having a direct impact on our level of freedom and rights in Palestine, this is not going to change. And I think that's where we need the most amount of action.
Yeah.
I mean, Em, on that, we're talking about anti-Palestinian racism there. Actually, just using that phrase, it's not a phrase you hear. It's not a phrase people are accustomed to hearing at all in this discussion, or any discussion whatsoever. The idea that there is obviously an illegal occupation, that is discussed, though we can see how there was attempts to shut that discussion down. But the fact that, in this case, Emma Watson doing a very mild display of solidarity with the Palestinian people is denounced as anti-Semitism, that should be seen as anti-Palestinian racism, because by definition, it's saying that even showing any basic show of compassion or solidarity towards this oppressed people is itself vicious hatred, intolerant and despicable hatred, is an act of racism. But the fact that we don't hear Palestinian voices in this discussion, the fact that, when you get reporting, it's portrayed as a conflict, as though there's two equal sides, rather than an occupation, one by a military superpower, the other by a long occupied people lacking basic rights. The fact that, the number of Palestinian dead in each assault isn't taken seriously at all in much of the coverage. How do we get people to take anti-Palestinian racism seriously, including in progressive circles? Sorry, I should say that. I should never clear eye. I always think I've lost my connection because my Wi-Fi's gone so dodgy. And I'm like, nope, they're gone. Sorry, go for it.
Well, I'm sure Salem could also speak to this. But I think it's a really important question. And I think one of the things that I often think about in terms of thinking about anti-Palestinian racism is also how it's not just sort of like active, sort of like Palestinians are evil, whatever. It's also like, they're erasure from these conversations. And I think also like, shamefully, I think even in like a lot of Jewish community circles where Israel is obviously a big topic of discussion, very rarely do you hear Palestinian voices in those circles either. And so I think that there is this sort of entire sort of denial of Palestinian experience because it is often framed as this threat to Jews or threat to Jewish identity or threat to even Israel, like whatever it is. And I think that the way that I think as a Jewish person wanting to show solidarity with the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian movement for freedom, I think it's important to recenter those voices and give up space and recognize and like how those voices are often invisible. And I also think it's about, as you say, like calling out the fact that, often every time people talk, or what I've noticed, particularly I think in British media, is every time there's a conversation, even about the occupation, right? Like there was an article in The Guardian recently where it was a conversation about, it was an article about sort of the occupation, the occupied territories and what like solidarity work going on there. But there was still even this like caveat of, and Palestinians commit violence too. And it's like this idea that we always have to associate, or there's expectation that you associate Palestinians inherently with violence is in itself a racist trope. And I think, like, to be honest, I also think this is just broadly part of a general sense of like anti-Arab racism, anti-Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian, like it's all part of that. And I think that as a white person and a white Jew, I also want to make sure that we are breaking down and challenging those kinds of narratives that exist within our society, in my community, but also more broadly as well. And I think and also showing that like there should be accountability, as Salem says, when Israel continues to act in this egregious way and that Palestinian lives matter, that is not okay. What's happened, like obviously what's happening in the occupied territories, what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, like that is unacceptable and like very clearly an example of ethnic cleansing. And we need to be able to use the language, not only that Palestinians have ascribed to their experience, but also calling it out for what it is. And I think sometimes there's a fear to call it out for what it is because of this confusion around, well, is it anti-Semitic to say that what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is ethnic cleansing? And it just isn't. That is not what anti-Semitism is. And I think that as a Jewish person, I feel I can play a role in challenging that and challenging that conflation.
Salem, I mean, in terms of, there'll be people watching or listening who are often progressively minded, who won't have thought about this in terms of anti-Palestinian racism. And that includes, for example, erasing Palestinians as a people from this conversation, not giving, any acknowledgement often of the existence of Palestinians is a form of racism. So what would you, how would you appeal to those progressives to take this seriously as a concept?
I think it echoes some of what Em already said. I think centering Palestinian voices for a very long time, we weren't the authors and the narrators of our own story. People spoke for us. I think there was a study done by a Palestinian academic that looked at the op-eds written in major American newspapers over the last 30, 40 years, and about less than 1% were written by Palestinians about Palestinians. And I think that's a very big part of it, is allowing us to talk about our stories and lead those conversations and listen to Palestinians. The other thing is the media has been the mainstream media has been such a vehicle for the dehumanization of Palestinians and echoes a lot of the narrative that Israel has put out into the world that plays to very racist stereotypes, terrorist, violent, backward, and these things perpetuate that idea. And I think accountability in general, whether it's, look, a lot of the people who might be listening to this have the privilege of living in a democracy where there is a form of accountability that can be levied against different institutions, regardless of what they are. And I think that needs to happen. And, you know, the silencing of our voices, whether it's in Palestine or the solidarity that supports us abroad, is also part of the fabric of your societies, your democracies, your values, your civil rights, and your ability to protest other things. And it might start with us today, but it eventually will impact the way you live your lives as well. So solidarity is about also intersectional support for one another, because what harms me today will harm you tomorrow. And I think this is a very important conversation to have, whether it's about surveillance, whether it's about walls, the weapons Israel sells to authoritarian regimes all over the world are the weapons that are tested on us. And so what happens here doesn't stay here. And that's a very important reminder to the world. So it starts with Palestine, but it doesn't end here. And that would be my message to everyone listening.
In terms of the effective strategies against the attempts to stigmatize even the most basic displays of solidarity with the Palestinian people, what do we think those strategies can look like? Let's start with you this time, Salem. What do you think those strategies to push back against the attempt to just shut down even the most basic rudimentary act of solidarity?
Say that again, Owen. You
so
cut
what
out.
What kind of strategies do you think are needed to push back against the attempt to just suffocate out of existence any attempt to show solidarity with the Palestinian people in the West?
Continue to speak up. I think continue to speak up, whether it's amongst your friends, your community, on social media. And I think it's important to transition this type of solidarity into political action and work within movements that are fighting for the same thing. At the end of the day, we need to also impact government policy and legislation. And I think that is the next step. And holding Israel accountable, holding the weaponization of anti-Semitism, the smearing, that needs to become a priority for us. So that for me is the most important part. And there's many ways that can be done. And whether it's in the UK, supporting different movements, different groups, different organizations like Em's, for example, or others who are doing this amazing work. But it needs to go from, you know, community work, movement work, to political work on the electoral level as well, so it can eventually impact legislation and policy. And this is something I often say when I'm speaking with, you know, parliamentarians from all around the world. As a Palestinian, I wish I didn't have to be sitting in front of you demanding that your country didn't enact policies and legislation that impacts my level of freedom. But sadly, that is the case. And so for those living in those countries, whether it's the UK, the US, or otherwise, you have the ability to show and put that accountability or demand that accountability from those people. So we need you to push back, and we need you to stand up.
And what do you think about the strategies needed? Not least, for example, given the push against boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a strategy, the government, well, Tory MPs looking to criminalise that. The same people, of course, who talk about the left being a threat to free speech. What do you think, Em? What are the kind of effective strategies to push back?
Well, I definitely agree with what Salem said about building, taking these next steps into sort of political accountability for what Israel is doing. I think that's absolutely crucial. But I also think in terms of this broader conversation around anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Semitism, I think we need a much better understanding of anti-Semitism. I think one that looks at like the conditions in which anti-Semitism thrives usually in societies of inequality, and thinking about like if we have a better societal global understanding of how anti-Semitism operates, it's much harder for it to be weaponized into this way to undermine and denigrate Palestinian human rights. And I think that is something that is severely lacking, I think, in the British political context at the moment. I think it's, you know, and it allows it to very easily to be weaponized in this way. And I think that, you know, as well as like really trying to build a sense of like leftist struggle that sees like anti-Semitism, Palestinian liberation, not anti-Palestinian racism, like as part of this anti-racism struggle, and like stop this stop these attempts by the right to continue to divide us and have us at each other's throats, rather than like actually thinking about how we work together and see that all our goals are the same. And so I think that to me, alongside sort of making sure that Israel is held accountable, is also making sure that I think that Jews also feel secure in Britain, in society, and feel comfortable being as part of the society, and don't feel, I guess, like to some extent, like don't feel like that, like the right is where their safety is, because I think like at the moment there is a real misunderstanding of that. And obviously that's a whole other potential show to talk about anti-Semitism. But I do think that in terms of that, alongside what Salem said, I think really getting a better understanding of how anti-Semitism operates and also the threat of the right is really crucial.
I mean, just a bit more on that end, because I mean, the statistics show that hate crimes against Jews are rising. They're surging in Britain and elsewhere. As discussed, anti-Semitism is ingrained in European culture. It didn't disappear with the Holocaust. A lot of people don't realise the last anti-Jewish riots in Britain were actually in 1947, after World War II had ended. I mean, how does this undermine the fight against the actual real menace of anti-Semitism, which does exist and is a growing problem?
I mean, I'm very reticent to let another conversation that should be
of course.
to come back to anti-Semitism, but I think I'll just say quickly, I think it completely cheapens the fight against anti-Semitism, partly because I think it's deeply racist to imply that Palestinian existence is somehow anti-Semitic or inherently anti-Jewish. But I also think it makes people fundamentally not think that anti-Semitism is real. Like, I think it makes people think that it's just a ploy to support the Israeli state, and that anti-Semitism isn't a real thing. And that makes Jews feel very unsafe. And I also think, it really speaks to this broader issue of how, like, I think that, like, the political class, like, whether, like, both in the Tories and in the Labour Party as well, like, are instrumentalizing, like, real Jewish anxiety to push their own political agendas. And often that political agenda is part of, like, this anti-Palestinian racism, whether it's saying nothing about, decades of occupation and apartheid, or, like, trying to push through this authoritarian legislation. So I think that unless we have a better understanding, and as long as sort of there is this constant desire to, like, conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, it just makes Jews a lot less safe. And I think that that's very dangerous. And I think a lot of the work that we can do, which is really exciting, is like, and also, like, particularly because, in May, when some people were saying quite anti-Semitic things, like, the first people to speak out about that were people from the Palestinian Liberation Movement to call that out. Like, I think this idea that Jews and Palestinians our needs are mutually exclusive is wrong, and actually that this is where the work is. So I think that that's, I don't want to go on about this for too long, but I do think that there is a real opportunity here for re-educating and rethinking about how we think about anti-Semitism in society more broadly, and how we think about it on the left in particular.
I mean, Salem, what are your thoughts about building stronger coalitions of both Jewish and Palestinian peace activists together, united against, of course, the occupation and apartheid in Israel? How do you see those coalitions at the moment, and what more can be done to build them?
I think it's absolutely critical. I think whether it's abroad or it's here, I think it's essential. We need to. It's not only about coexistence; it's about co-resistance. And to dismantle apartheid and rebuild a different system and social contract where, whether you're Palestinian, Jewish, or otherwise, you have the same freedom, rights, and equalities, that takes us doing it together. And it's essential to be able to find and connect with like-minded Palestinians and Jews here and all over the world to be able to do that. And pressure is going to come, needs to come from internally. To this system, to dismantle it, to go through a system of decolonization, but also externally. I mean, because of the asymmetry of power between us and the apartheid regime and the occupation regime, we need solidarity from abroad. It's such a critical part of our struggle. And so the solidarity between Jewish groups and Palestinian groups, but all types of groups, progressive groups that are fighting for the same values, is essential. Is absolutely essential. So, this is something that is increasing and has been increasing, and it's amazing, but we're in the beginning of that. And at the moment, those solidarity movements are much stronger abroad than they are here, for many reasons, among them the apartheid regime and its ability or its denial of our ability to move and connect, even amongst Palestinians within ourselves. So, but it's critical, it's essential. And I think if we're ever going to see a different social contract where all of us have the same freedoms and rights, it's going to be when we do it together.
What do you think, Em, on that?
Yeah, I think that the future is freedom, equality, and dignity for everyone in this land, and that it's absolutely like co-resistance is key. And for a number of years, I've been involved with an organization called the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which brings international Jews to the West Bank and East Jerusalem to undertake solidarity, co-resistance with Palestinian communities. And for me, that's been the most transformational and important work for really thinking about building a future in Israel-Palestine that like models these values of justice and equality and freedom, and also the importance of like really showing, like having a Jewish presence in Palestine solidarity movements. I think like in allyship, in co-resistance, for Jews to sort of put their bodies on the line and say that we will not stand for the state and military violence being done in our name is like really fundamental, I think, to this struggle. And I think that combined with this broader sort of political agitation and political accountability is absolutely crucial. I think that's the only way forward. And it's been a privilege to be part of that work.
Just finally, Salem, I mean, you said that this apartheid regime, it's got more and more severe. I mean, Human Rights Watch last year, about a year ago now, and let's be honest, Human Rights Watch are not known as a radical human rights organization. They're seen as kind of relatively milquetoast for quite, I mean, they do excellent work, don't get me wrong, and a whole range of spheres, but they're not known as some sort of radical NGO. But they describe, of course, the situation as apartheid. What is the situation on the ground in ways that I think maybe people in the West often don't understand and need to grasp about how intolerable, how suffocating the occupation and apartheid has become, which Western governments, of course, are directly complicit in because of their active support for the Israeli state in its occupation?
Yeah, I missed some of that question, but I'm assume how suffocating has the Israeli apartheid regime been, and how has it increasingly become so? Yeah, so just very briefly to distill it to its essential feature, you have one system and essentially a one-state reality between the river and the sea, where Israel and the regime controls every human being, and it allocates freedom and rights based on your ethno-national identity. If you're Jewish, you have the full spectrum of rights. If you're Palestinian, you're put into different categories. And those categories determine a hierarchy of freedom and rights. So it gets worse and worse and worse depending where you live and what ID you have. And what has been happening, over time is Palestinians have been put into these shrinking, population centers, Bantustans, with very increasingly limited rights. I mean, we barely have access to water. And when you want to talk about the climate justice and climate emergency, Israel controls our entire water supply, but allocates 80% of that water to illegal Israeli settlements that are considered a war crime next to Palestinian cities. And so we get 20% of our own water in an area and a part of the world that is increasingly drying and becoming increasingly arid. So this is one example how apartheid works. The levels of violence have been increasing, the killing of Palestinians, detaining and killing of children, the ability of fascist Israeli settlers who live in these settlements to roam the hills of the West Bank in mobs, to look for Palestinian farmers to attack, beat up, and shoot at, with being aided and abetted by the Israeli army, is becoming an everyday occurrence here. We are no longer safe on our roads, on our land, on any given day. And so it's becoming worse. And there's no way for us to hold it accountable, because Israel and its military is the extreme authority here. And that's why, again, I go back to this idea, solidarity is so important, as it's getting extremely dark. And without another form of accountability mechanism coming from abroad to help this liberation movement, it's going to be very hard. and it's extremely important now more than ever.
Em and Salem, you've both been absolutely brilliant. Such a thorough dissection of the issue, its complexities, but also talking practically about what people can do to show their support with the Palestinian people. And I think it is heartening that despite the fact we are seeing an attempt to silence voices, it does feel like the dam has burst somewhat, and particularly amongst younger people. Let's be generous, people under 40, so I can claw my way in to that bracket. People under 40, the millennials and the Zoomers, who will save us all in Western countries, attitudes have shifted. I think it's very striking in the United States, actually, because actually it used to be the case amongst many people who regard themselves as progressives that to criticize the Israeli occupation was seen as kind of not something you did at all. And now you've seen a very dramatic shift. You've seen, particularly in the United States, a whole generation of younger Jewish activists who are very, very loud and very, very prominent in their support for solidarity with Palestine. It does feel like things are changing and shifting. We're seeing a very angry and quite scared, but still nonetheless quite effective attempt to shut down that solidarity and support. But it is, the question is, I suppose, how effective will that be if those attitudes continue to shift in such a dramatic way, thanks to the work of people like both yourselves in raising awareness. So huge solidarity, not least for Salem, who is, of course, in Ramallah. It's been such an honor to have you both. So thank you so much and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Owen. Appreciate it.
Now, I know my internet connection is actually quite dodgy. I can tell. It does this thing where it just lights up Wi-Fi, kind of a Wi-Fi problem, which is unfortunate. But we could only do that really by trying it out here in Barcelona. So I'll just wrap up quickly because I probably look like a big old blob. It was probably an improvement, if anything. Maybe I should make this a permanent fixture. Yeah, I am in Barcelona. I posted about this. I do realize anything I post is going to probably, like pictures of my cats. I put pictures of my cats on Twitter and have bad faith responses to it, abuse. And I used to be kind of like all these bad faith attacks. I'm like, well, this is tedious. Now I'm like, nothing I can do about it. Yeah, I came to Barcelona to finish my book, and I said I was there for enforced solitude, and some people interpreted that as me saying that I was suffering a huge hardship by coming to Barcelona. I've written about Barcelona in my book partly because they've got a progressive administration here. I wasn't claiming that. I know it's a big privilege to be able to be in Barcelona and to do my work. It's a very cliched thing. Lots of authors, I've got to finish a book. It's called, I'll briefly explain. Lots of authors throughout history obviously just go somewhere to finish a book. That's all it is. I realize the vast majority of people can't do that work. The Telegraph apparently are doing a diary feature about it. I've just been told this by James Schneider, who used to work for Jeremy Corbyn. He's also writing a book abroad. So they're going to throw us both in. I mean, I suppose if it sucks up right-wing newspapers' resources, stops them going on about migrants, Muslims, trans people, write as many diary pieces as you want. So it's gonna suck up your time and money. The book is called The Alternative and How We Build It. And what I've done is interview thousands of people, I think, at this point, looking at models across the world, things we can learn from, but also just ideas that economists, academics, progressive, campaigners, activists, a huge range of issues, how we transform the economy, health, climate justice, trying to link it together, look at examples of movements fighting and struggling. That's what we've been doing. So that's the idea of the book. It's going to come out in the autumn. I'm here to finish it just because if I'm in London, I'm surrounded by people and I was just more likely not to do my book. But people on Twitter have interpreted it in a different way. Well, only people who, to be honest, breathing would probably be seen as a terrible, outrageous affront on my part. Anyway, that was great. Despite the Wi-Fi problems, which we will fix, I promise you. We'll be back on Sunday at 12 o'clock. I will continue to write this book. We'll do interviews while I'm here. I'll do my very best. We will be expanding the channel in February onwards, because I can actually commit proper time, because I won't have my book tapping on my shoulder. So it's like a gremlin just tapping on my shoulder. Everything I do, it's like, why aren't you doing your book, you bloody Stopfordian idiot. So we will be expanding then. Thanks for your support. That's why we're doing those documentaries. So do support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84. Thanks to Tad and David Barwater. This was an impromptu show, so sorry it was so impromptu. But as I said, I think we'll be doing it every Thursday. I'm not sure it'll be 7. It might be 6 o'clock, but I will double check that. But we'll be here Sunday at 12 o'clock as per usual. But we've got loads of great ideas, and people on Patreon, I'm going to do a post to get ideas, because all the documentaries and so on we've done are because of you. We're going to be doing shorter videos as well as the longer videos because that's what we need. We need these shorter videos. Obviously, a lot of those on Facebook that's very, on Instagram and so on. We've already been doing clips, but we'll be doing more shorter videos for YouTube as well. All right, everybody. Well, I better go back to my book, Hear My Own, in my enforced solitude, which is a huge privilege. Okay, Telegraph diary writers. I'm not pretending to suffer. Thanks for all the guests. Lots of love. Sorry about the Wi-Fi connection. We will fix it. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.